All right. Cool. All right. Thank you for coming, everybody. As I'm sure you saw and what made you decide to come here, I'm going to be talking a little bit about jQuery widgets and making them famous, kind of in a couple of ways, both ways playing on the word famous. But kind of the first way and what might help explain this a little bit is, so I'm actually talking more about like making jQuery widgets famous. And I don't know, how many people are familiar with Famous, the company, the animation engine? Nobody? Okay, cool, that's fine. So I'll talk a little bit more about what that is as we go along. But that's just my info. So I'm the executive director of the jQuery Foundation. So I don't really get to write code that often anymore. So actually writing this talk was a fun change. I mostly run like the business side of things for the foundation, talking with our current projects, potential projects, working on finding supporting members, things like that. So that's my contact info. So if you ever want to ask questions about what's going on at the foundation or just chat about maybe your company or you yourself have an open source project that you may want to bring into sort of an open governance model rather than just doing it on your own, please reach out. So, and being the executive director of the jQuery Foundation, I probably wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't talk a little bit about the foundation itself. So it's a 501c6 nonprofit trade association, originally formed to support the jQuery projects, so like jQuery, jQuery UI, jQuery mobile, those types of things. And now we've started expanding beyond that into other projects in the space. We do a lot of work in standards. I'm going to touch on a little bit of that, but the main thing that we're trying to emphasize is it's not just about jQuery anymore. So anybody here familiar with Prima? No? Okay, good. So Prima is a JavaScript parser written in JavaScript. So a lot of people build tools on top of it, so things like code style checkers or code validation. Up until just recently, Facebook with React, if you're familiar with React at all and JSX, parsing the JSX into actual JavaScript was being done with Prima. So that's one of our newer projects that has joined us recently. Chassis is kind of a new venture, new experiment that we have going on right now, which is it's meant to be a CSS framework for CSS frameworks. So it's basically trying to be that chassis that all of the frameworks can build on top of, and would give them a common base so that if you're building for Bootstrap and either start a new project or want to move your project to like Zerb Foundation or something like that, you can just with minimal effort pick it up and move it over because the base is the same. So that's the goal. It's kind of a lofty goal, but we're seeing if we can get it done. Globalize, I'm going to talk about this one a little bit more later, and that kind of gets into the other famous part of the title, which is sort of bringing your applications to the rest of the world through internationalization. Globalize is our JavaScript internationalization and localization library, which is really cool, really starting to take off. Adobe's using it, Twitter's looking at it. So that's another one that's, I think, worth checking out, and I'll show a little bit of what it can do later. And like I said, we're doing a lot of work in standards, so we have a lot of representation at the W3C on different working groups. We have a couple of reps on ECMA's TC39 committee, which defines JavaScript as a language, or ECMAScript. And so, yeah, so that's another big thing that we're doing is a lot of work in terms of standards and bringing the developer voice to standards rather than just having it all being driven by browser vendors and things like that. So now that I've told you a little bit about the jQuery Foundation and how it's not all about jQuery, let's talk about jQuery. Like I said, we're going to talk about widgets, or more accurately, jQuery plugins. So when I say widgets, there's really two kind of things we can be talking about. There's widgets in terms of jQuery UI widgets, specific to the jQuery UI library that use the jQuery UI widget engine. But we're not talking about those. Basically, when I say widgets in this context, it's just jQuery plugins that are user interface elements. So things like tabs or accordions or menus or carousels or whatever. And I'm assuming most people are familiar with Bootstrap. Bootstrap is like the most popular set of jQuery plugins. Some people may not realize that all of their JavaScript components, so their carousels and all of those types of things, are all just jQuery plugins. And so with that, what I'm going to use throughout this talk is the carousel. So I wanted to start off with Bootstrap's carousel. So this is just a really simple carousel, right? So just to kind of give us a base for what we're talking about. So super simple. It's just a set of images that you can page through. It might be kind of hard to see, but it has a caption. It has an indicator of which image you're on, that type of stuff. So pretty straightforward, but that's kind of the basis of what I'm going to be building throughout this talk. Yeah. Is Node.js a jQuery Foundation project?
No, it's a
I'm.
Sorry, the Node.js
Mm-hmm.
jQuery project.
jQuery. Oh, plugin. No. Node.js is no. Node.js is JavaScript running on the server. Yeah. So it's an entire JavaScript environment on the server. So the Bootstrap carousel. So it's super simple to initialize. Actually, with Bootstrap, you don't even have to even call the JavaScript to initialize it. They actually give you the ability to just define everything in your markup, and then the JavaScript in the background just takes care of it all and kicks it off for you. But if in certain situations you need to initialize it yourself, it's super simple. It's just jQuery. You select your element and call .carousel, and then you get your carousel. So Famous. I think no one said they were familiar with Famous. Okay. So Famous is doing some really cool stuff in the world of 3D animation, physics, those types of things, all written in JavaScript. And so they're a startup out in San Francisco. They recently just joined the jQuery Foundation. They're one of our top level members. They also actually just joined the Node Foundation, and they're one of their top supporting members as well. So they're doing some really awesome stuff, both with JavaScript and for the JavaScript community. They're actually running jQuery conference right now. I'm missing the first day of jQuery conference, so I go straight from here to San Francisco tonight. But yeah, so they're doing all kinds of awesome stuff for the JavaScript world, and specifically their 3D animation and physics engine are what we're going to be kind of adding to our carousel today. So this is just their site, just to kind of give you an idea of what they do. Let's see. Yeah, there we go. So this is kind of their hello world, right? So they just take their logo and spin it around in 3D space. Pretty simple, but they do some other cool stuff, like flipping around that set of dots. And remember, this is all just written in JavaScript, but it's super smooth, super responsive. And even, I'm not going to refresh again, but this one is usually a set of dots that you can actually interact with, and they move around like almost like a surface of like water, which is pretty cool too. But anyway, so that's what Famous does. So they're that engine all written in JavaScript. But sort of one of the points, kind of the key point of this talk is if you look at what it takes to make these things happen, you kind of have to be an expert in like 3D animation and physics to actually be able to make these things happen. And so what we're trying to do is work with them to take the awesome stuff that they're doing, apply that to common jQuery plugins like carousels or menus or whatever, and package that up in a jQuery plugin so that developers can just say, I want this really awesome carousel in my app, and just drop it in and go, and not have to understand how to build it themselves with Famous. So, oops, that's the Bootstrap. So this is Famous's carousel. So you'll see it's very similar. We've got the same sort of navigation through the items. I didn't go too crazy with the animation yet. We'll kind of play with it a little bit later to show off some of the other things. But what you can see is it has that physics. So as an item slides in, it kind of gives it that rotation like it's being acted upon by gravity and physics and whatever. And it just gives it that more, I don't know, like tactile feel when you're interacting with something, and it feels more natural rather than just a stiff slide, right? And so if you look at their examples, so what the carousel is, so they don't actually have any of these items, any of these widgets packaged up for distribution yet. So what I'm doing here today to show you is just kind of a hack to show you what the future can be. So for the carousel, they have a whole article out there on how to build the carousel, and it's a way to learn the internals of Famous. And so it seems really simple because you just grab this bundle and drop it in your page, and it just works. But it's not exactly that simple because, and that's just a link off to the lesson. But basically, what you have to do is, so everything is built modularly, which is not wrong by any means. But you have to understand sort of build tools in the JavaScript world in order to even use this carousel. So you have to clone their repo, and then here's the kind of the structure that you get. So you can see it's all broken down into different modules. And then you actually have to understand Node and NPM. You have to do an NPM install to get all of its dependencies, and then NPM run build to actually build that bundle.js so that you can use it. So the one thing that was missing, and so I took this as an opportunity to kind of show what's going on inside of the Famous carousel a little bit. There's no caption on their carousel, and so I wanted to be able to compare apples to apples with the Bootstrap carousel. So I figured let's add a caption so you can kind of see what's going on inside of this Famous carousel. So right now, all of these images are just stored as strings in an array in a JSON file, and it's just strings with the different image URLs. So what I did was just modified that array to be an array of objects with a URL and then an associated caption. So now we have captions for our images, and we need to add them into Famous. So inside of Famous, inside of the Famous carousel, in order to create those images, they have this DOM element object. So you have to create a new DOM element, and then you can set properties on it to apply styles and things like that. So that's where they're adding the image. They're actually setting it. So a new DOM element by default is just a div. And so then they set the background of that div to that image. And then what I did was just at the bottom there, you can just drop in some content. Since the div itself is empty and it's just using a background image for the image, I can just drop in some content, and now I have my caption on top of the image. And I gave it a class so that I could just do some simple like positioning and formatting of the text. And so with that, come over here. And we'll check out my add caption branch. And then just like before, because it's all still modularized, I have to build it. So that just takes a second. So, but what that shows is that the cool thing about Famous is, yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah, I can make it bigger here. I think I can just. Is that better? All right. So the cool thing about what Famous does, so they can render to WebGL, they can render to Canvas, they can render to DOM. And so what we're doing in our example is rendering everything to the DOM. They also have this new thing that's still, I think, being finished, but it's called mixed mode, where you can actually render DOM and WebGL together. And so they have not the most useful example, but a really awesome example is they have a cube rotating in 3D space, and each face of the cube is actually an iframe with a web page on it that you can still interact with. And it's pretty crazy when they do that and then they set those pages to that page, and so it's just like 3D cubes all the way down. It's pretty cool. But anyway, so we got that built, and now we can look and see that we should be comparing apples to apples now. So now we have our caption. Again, what's cool is with the physics, you can see it because it's within that div. Well, you can kind of see it with the black text, but the captions are there at the bottom, and they also animate with the image. All right. You can just ignore my calendar popping up. Let's see. So jQuery can help here. So I showed kind of how complex some of this stuff is to be able to do all of this, to build out your own carousel with Famous. And so what we're trying to do is help by packaging it up as jQuery plugins. So you can just drop them in your page, give them some configuration maybe, and just use them. So plugin authoring. Has anybody ever built a jQuery plugin? Cool. All right, so just some of the real basics so that you kind of understand where we're going. So $.fn is where you would put your functions, your plugin. By putting it on the $.fn object, that makes it available to your jQuery collection when you do a selection. So when you say, give me dollar pound carousel, so you say, give me the element that has the ID of carousel. By putting your plugin on $.fn, now you can say, I have my collection dot carousel. So that's where you put your plugins. You should always wrap your plugin in an IIFE, which is an immediately invoked function expression. Basically what that is, so it's just that wrapper there. And what it gives you is a couple of things. So it privatizes everything inside of it. So any of the variables that are created there are only available inside of that IIFE. And then it also protects the dollar. So there are other libraries out there, a number of them that use the dollar like jQuery does. And so by passing jQuery into your IIFE and setting it to the dollar, now you know within your IIFE the dollar is jQuery, and you can use that without it being blown away by something else. And then the other thing that people really like about jQuery is the ability to chain. So you can say, whatever my jQuery collection is, dot, do something, dot, do something else, dot, do something else. And that's provided by returning this. This object within the context of a plugin is that collection. It gets passed in as that context. So when you return this, you're sending that collection back so that you can call the next jQuery method on it. All right, so let's actually wrap this carousel up in a plugin. One quick note, and I kind of mentioned this before, is that because Famous hasn't built out all of these widgets yet, and we're working with just a learning article that they put together, there are a lot of things that I'm going to do here that could be done better, but I'm just hacking it together to make it work, to show you how it works and how it could be once they actually build these plugins to distribute. And I'll kind of point those things out as we go, where I'm kind of just hacking instead of doing it the right way. So back to those plugin basics. So we're going to call our plugin FJQ Carousel, Famous jQuery Carousel, and we put it on the $.fn inside of our IFI. And what we need to do then is instantiate the Famous engine. Just like your jQuery plugins assume that jQuery is available, it assumes that you've included jQuery in your application before that plugin is included. We're also assuming that Famous is there in this example. Again, this is one of those things, and I'll touch it later too, where if you're building the plugin yourself, you're probably going to have a build process where you would pull in just the pieces of Famous you need, just the pieces of jQuery you need, and have as minimal of a package as possible. But for this example, I'm just dropping in all of Famous and all of jQuery just for simplicity. So if you remember that file structure and all of the files were modularized, again, since I'm not going to build out an entire build system for this, I just grabbed all of those files and concatenated them together. The one note is that the carousel .js has to come last because it actually is what puts the other three pieces together into the carousel. So it has a dependency on them. And so here's where we update so within that modularized system, they're using require to pull in just the pieces that they need. Since we're not doing that and we have all of Famous available to us, we just pull them off of the Famous object instead of pulling in the individual pieces. So that was that quick change. And you can see that the dot notation through the object is the exact same as the file structure within Famous, so it's easy to just make that translation. Also, if you remember back, so all of our images and their captions were in this JSON file, right? But I figured since we're using jQuery and jQuery is good at pulling things out of the DOM, why don't we just put them in the DOM? Because then if for some reason you're loading like some remote script and it fails or whatever and like JavaScript bombs, at least all of your images are still there. So your layout might be thrashed, but at least your users are still able to see everything, even if you don't have the nice carousel. So I just moved those images out into image tags within the DOM. And you'll see here, I also put their captions there as data attributes. So I just have data caption and the caption for each one. And then in our plugin, so we have all of our files. Yeah.
Is it possible to transform the picture in base64, for example?
That's a good question.
Or to decrease the size picture?
Probably. Yeah, I mean, you should be. It shouldn't matter because it's still being rendered to the DOM, so it should just render the image and then it should still animate. I haven't tried it, but I don't see why it wouldn't work. So yeah, so we have all of the Famous carousel code in our plugin, and now this is again one of those hacky things where I didn't want to go through and change all of their code from this lesson, and so I'm actually, now that we moved all of the images into the DOM, I'm just pulling that data out of the DOM and putting it back into a JSON object and passing it into Famous. So it's kind of silly, but it's more just to demonstrate that that you can have those images living in the DOM and still make this all work. The other piece there where I'm removing the images again is just, it's kind of hacky, but this is more just to demonstrate what you can do. And then inside of your plugin, you instantiate the carousel. So that carousel function is provided by the famous code. And so this, in this context, again, is the jQuery collection inside of our plugin. And you can pull the selector off of that. So whatever selector you used to create your jQuery collection. So in our case, we're probably just grabbing a div that contains our carousel. That selector that you used, you pass that into Famous so that it knows where to render the carousel that it builds. And then you pass in that page data, which has the image URLs and the captions. All right, so before we move on to customization, so now we will check out JQ1 and come over here and refresh. And so now this is the exact same carousel as the famous carousel that we just looked at, but it's wrapped in a jQuery plugin. So there's no way to do any customization or anything, but this is being, here I can show you. It might actually, we'll see how, yeah, that's going to be too small. Let me see if I can make it bigger. But you can see here, nope, that's not going to zoom where I need it to zoom. Let me see if I can. All right. You can't see it, but basically it's the really simple instantiation like the Bootstrap Carousel. So now we just say, it's down there at the bottom, but you can't really see it. But it's just $carousel.fjq carousel, and we get our carousel. Yeah, that's what I did. Maybe because I wasn't. Yeah, see, it keeps zooming up there. I don't know. So anyway, so yeah, so now we have the same carousel just wrapped in a jQuery plugin. Super simple. So now technically you could just distribute this if you didn't want to be able to do anything else with it. If you just wanted to be able to say, here's a set of images, make a carousel that looks like this, done. And now you can distribute this and people can just grab it, put in their images, and they have a carousel and not have to know anything about Famous. But we should probably add some customization. So a piece that I left out of the plugin authoring basics was passing in options, and so we'll look at that now. So if you look at the carousel, when it slides, all they're doing is a little bit of a wobble on the y-axis, right, to show that motion. But I figured, well, let's just like make it fun and add some rotation to the z-axis too, right? And so, anybody familiar with quaternions or Euler angles? Awesome, because I was not until I started playing with this. Right. So my super basic high-level understanding of it is Euler angles are a set of 3 angles to describe something's position in 3D space. And then quaternions use sets of Euler angles to determine a path of movement through 3D space. And so that's the type of stuff they do inside of Famous that allows you to do those awesome 3D animations and add physics and things like that. So you'll see on that set of Euler angles, they're just adjusting the y angle. And so we can just mess around with the x, the first one, that first 0, to give it some rotation on the x axis. So like I said before, in order to add options to your plugin, you just pass in options where I have plugin options there. And then by using jQuery.extend, basically what you can do is set defaults for your options. And so it takes the plugin options object and merges it with your object that you have in there that has your defaults. And so I called this option spinny. And so if you pass in an option spinny, it'll overwrite your default. Otherwise, it uses that default within your plugin. And then we can take that option within our plugin and put it in that the X axis from the Euler angles. So I'm just using a ternary there, and I'm just saying if plugin settings spinny is true, just set this to 10, otherwise leave it 0. And then if you want to actually use that, when we instantiate our plugin, we just pass in that object with spinny set to true. And when we do that, now we get that. So again, there's no real business use case for this, right? It's just to show how you can do things, how you can pass options in and have them change things within Famous for your users that are actually using this plugin that you distribute. And it's just fun, right? But there are places where doing stuff like this could be useful. So for things like menus, so if you have menus that slide out, if you give them a little bit of physics and some nice animation, it just makes them feel better, right? So are you familiar with Google's material design? They talk a lot about animation and how much that adds to the user experience. I mean, not like crazy animations like this, but subtle animations here and there that just feel natural really add to the user experience. And so things like menus or cards, like the little, there's a lot of use of cards now in user interfaces, and you can have them flip over for more information, stuff like that. Or product listings, so I think even Amazon might have a carousel of featured products and things like that. So there are things out there with sort of business use cases where we could apply some of these nice animations. And so with that product listing in mind, I was kind of thinking about, well, what can I do to kind of make this seem a little bit more useful other than just kind of flipping an image around. And so I've been really getting into biking, long distance biking, and I was like, oh, well, I'll just create kind of a bike catalog. And I'm not a designer, so don't make fun of how bad this looks. But it's mostly just that same carousel, but we're thinking about it as kind of a bike catalog. The other thing I wanted to do was, earlier I mentioned globalize, and so what kind of adds to this, the sort of at least business use of this, is being able to localize currencies. So if my catalog shows prices, I want to be able to, one, apply exchange rates, which that's not what Globalize does. You would do that on your own. But then with Globalize, format those currencies, how they're displayed, based on how the user identifies themselves or the language that they use. And so something like this. So if you have, if everything you build is based on English and US dollars, but someone says, well, I speak German and I want it in euros, then it would turn into something like this based on the changes we're going to make. So obviously the $400 would turn into this, and the exchange rate is just numbers I pulled a few days ago, so it's probably wrong now. But it would, you can see it replaces the decimals with commas, and it moves the currency symbol to the end. And so that's what Globalize does for you. It knows, based on the locale and the currency, what symbols to use and where to put them. And yeah, so I already talked about what Globalize is. It's the Internationalization Localization Library, and it's based on CLDR data. Anybody familiar with Unicode CLDR? I always forget. We'll see if it loads on the Wi-Fi. Yeah, Common Locale Data Repository. So basically, it's just an entire repository of things like date formatting, currency formatting, all of that for like every locale that you can think of, and like different variations of languages. It's all there, and it's pretty amazing. And so Globalize is built on top of that data, and so it can always be up to date with like the latest updates in what's going on in terms of how things are formatted in different languages. So let's modify our plugin to kind of make it into a byte catalog with localized currencies. So we're going to add some more options. So before, you can see all we had was the spinny option. We're just going to add one more object to that called localize. And that's where we can set our locale, our currency, and the exchange rate. So by default, we're just going to use English, we're going to use US dollars, and the exchange rate is 1-to-1. A minor change, we're just going to change where we were storing the captions on the images. Like before, we're going to change that to a price. And we just set our US dollar price on our images of our bikes. And then this is just another minor change. So if you remember back in our plugin where we pulled all of the URLs and captions off of the images, wrapped them up in an object to be passed into Famous. Instead of a caption now, we're just passing in a price. And then here is where we were displaying the caption before, and now it's a little bit more because this is where Globalize comes in. So the first thing I did was I'm actually going to store our price on the caption now, and what that allows us to do is change the currency and language on the fly, because we no longer have those images, right? We pulled that data off, passed it into Famous, and then removed those images from the DOM. So we need to put that price back in somewhere so we have it to use it later, so that we know what we're formatting when the user makes a change to the language or the currency. So we store the price there on our caption, and then the price that we display, we run through Globalize. So we just take Globalize, we set its locale to the setting, which by default is English, and then we call format currency. We pass in the price times our exchange rate and the currency that we're using, which by default is USD. And so we just pass all that into Globalize, and what Globalize spits out is a string formatted based on that input. So it would spit out that $400.00. And then what we do is we add a method. So one more piece of plugin authoring that we didn't cover at the beginning is actually being able to provide methods for people to use with your plugin. So exposing methods that people can use to apply to your plugin. So we create this update currency method. The way that it's set up here is kind of a little trick, but it's kind of smart. So when you call a method of a jQuery plugin, the way you do that is you call your plugin. So you would say whatever you selected .fjq carousel, and then the first parameter that you pass in is a string with the name of the function that you're trying to call. So what we do here is by putting our method inside of an object that I just called externals, we can then check if what's being passed in is a string, and if it is, then we know that we need to peel off the rest of those options and apply update currency with those options. So basically, what it does is it decides, okay, did you give me a string? If so, that means I need to call a method. If not, then you're actually initializing a new plugin, so I'll just go on and do my thing. So that's what that little bit there is. And then inside of update currency, let me scroll this over just a little bit. It's basically doing the same thing we did before. It's creating a globalized object with the locale that you pass in, and it creates a currency formatter with the currency that you passed in, and then it loops through every caption and reformats it based on what you put in there, like what the user asked for. And so yeah, so this is just illustrating what I was talking about before. So if you wanted to call the update currency method on your plugin, that's how you would do it. You just pass in the name of that function as a string as the first parameter. Again, build process would make this much nicer, but for our example, I just dropped in a whole bunch of script tags with all of the pieces of CLDR.js and globalize. And then similarly, I pull in all of the data that I need for. So what you'll see here is, so the CLDR data itself, there's a ton of it. So you don't ever want to just dump all of it in there because it's huge. I think I downloaded it, it was like an 11 megabyte zip. So it's just massive. So you only want the pieces that you need for your application. So what we're pulling in here, the likely subtags is kind of the core. So that's just all, you always have to pull that in. Numbering systems you need for number formatting. And then the specific locale number data, so English, German, and Japanese are what I'm pulling into this application. And then similarly for currency, you need the currency supplemental data and then the locale specific currency information for those English, German, and Japanese. Like I said before, I just have some exchange rates just hard coded in my catalog. You would likely, based on your use case, like go out to some service and pull those all the time or once a day or however your application works. You would want to go get your exchange rates. But I just have them hard-coded for now. And so then creating our carousel, because we have all those defaults set, so we have spinny set to false, so it's not going to do the fun rotation anymore. And then by default, we have set English, US dollars, and the exchange rate of 1. So because those are all defaults, we don't have to pass in any options. So we can just say $carousel.fjq carousel, and we'll get our carousel. And then the last thing we have to do is just add some event listeners. So I added a couple of just select menus, drop-down menus to above our carousel where the user can pick a locale and a currency. And then we just add some event listeners to listen for the change on those. And then we use the update currency method to update all of those currencies that are displayed on the fly. So I'm not going to do that yet because we need to actually see it work. So we will check out JQ3 and refresh. All right, so now you can see we've got our bike store. I swapped out the images with just some bike images. It's really small, but up on the top left there you can see, and I didn't change my label. So the second one should say currency, not language twice. So the first one is language, and then the second one is choosing a currency. And so now you can see, so it still works just like before. It's got the little bit of physics on it. It's got some different prices, all properly formatted. And then we say, I don't know, I'm in the UK, and so I want to see Great British pounds. And so just by changing that, the update currency method changes the currency, applies the exchange rate, and reformats. And it does it to all of them, so you can flip back through and they've all been adjusted. If you change the language, so let's say we go to German, so now it's going to show you it's still in pounds, but you'll see we swapped out the decimal point for a comma. We put the currency symbol at the end because that's how you would expect to see it if you were reading this in German. And then, yeah, similarly, I mean, it's all the same thing, but we can see. So again, so that's 67,507 yen. But because we're using German, we use the period instead of a comma for the thousands indicator with the yen symbol at the end. But if we switch to Japanese, it's going to pull our symbol back to the front and use commas. And so with that, that's pretty much it. So what I've been trying to illustrate here is just the things you can do with Famous are amazing. They're just really complex unless you are like a 3D graphics expert. And so what we're trying to do is work with them to help them build some of these widgets using their engine, give different options to do some different useful tweaks to the animations, package that up in a jQuery plugin so then people can just grab them and use them and have that power of Famous without actually having to fully understand the engine to make it work. And so it gives you that beautiful UI and the power of Famous, but that ease of using a jQuery plugin. And so with that, that's about it.